What would you do if the only thing anyone would give you was the one thing nobody else wanted? For Wren Calloway, 20 years old and freshly orphaned in a grey little harbour town most maps didn't bother to name, this wasn't a riddle. It was Tuesday. Her uncle handed her $17.40, folded once, and the salvage rights to a rusted cargo submarine that had been sitting on its side in the mud of Widow's Slough since before her father was born. The whole town called it the Cormorant, and the whole town agreed on exactly one thing about it. It was worthless. Dead steel. A grave, some said, though no one liked to say whose. But something had been sealed inside that hull 60 years ago, something patient enough to wait for the right hands to come looking, and what Wren found there would not just change her life. It would call a very old debt due. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Before there was a wreck, before there was a ledger entry with her name on it, there was a dock, and a girl of 8 sitting cross-legged on sun-warmed planks, watching her father work. Silas Calloway had hands like braided rope, thick-knuckled, scarred pale in a dozen places where hot metal or cold wire had bitten him over 30 years of diving and building and fixing whatever the sea broke. He was not a rich man. He was, in Hollow Point Cove, something better, a man everyone needed and nobody could replace. He kept the harbor's boats afloat. He went down in the old canvas and brass dress when a prop fouled or a hull needed a patch below the waterline, and he came up every time with the same unhurried calm, water sluicing off the copper helmet, as if the ocean were simply another room in his house. He taught Wren the way older watermen teach, not in lectures, but in tasks. By 6 she could tie a bowline with her eyes shut. By 10 she could read a length of oakum caulking with her fingertips and tell you, blind, whether it had been packed tight enough to hold. By 14 she'd been down 40 feet in the harness herself, her father topside working the air pump, trusting her with his own held breath. The sea doesn't lie to you, he told her once, crouched beside her on a barnacled hull, guiding her hand along a seam. It tells you exactly what's wrong, if you're patient enough to listen with your hands instead of your eyes. That became the whole shape of her education. Patience. Listening. Trusting a seam, a sound, a weight, over a guess. The one soft thing in a hard trade was the compass. It had belonged to his own father, and his father before that. A small brass diver's compass, its case scratched dull, its needle steady as a held breath even in rough water. Silas fastened it to a leather cord and put it around Wren's neck the winter she turned 9. The same week her mother's photograph came down off the mantel for good, undiscussed, the way hard things were handled in that house. Doesn't matter how deep you go, he said, closing her fingers around it. That'll always tell you which way is up. She wore it every day after that, tucked under her collar, warm against her collarbone whether she was elbow-deep in a bilge or asleep in her bed above the boat shed. It was the only thing in the world she owned outright, and it was worth, by any honest appraisal, almost nothing at all. She would have traded her whole inheritance to keep it, and in time, that is essentially what happened. Silas Calloway died on a grey October morning the way workingmen like him so often do. Not dramatically, not at sea, but quietly, his heart simply stopping while he sat mending a net on the porch, as if even his body had decided not to make a fuss. Wren was 17. There was no will, because there had never been anything much to will. There was a boat shed with a leaking roof, a set of diving gear worth more in sentiment than dollars, and a girl who suddenly belonged, on paper at least, to her father's older brother. Garrett Calloway ran the harbor office at the top of the pier, a narrow room that smelled of ink and pipe tobacco, its walls lined with ledgers going back 60 years. Where Silas had measured a man by the steadiness of his hands, Garrett measured everything, cargo, debts, people, by the steadiness of a column of figures. He took Wren in because it would have looked poorly not to, and he made sure she always understood the difference between charity and obligation. She ate in the kitchen with the hired girl. She was given chores instead of an allowance, and reminders instead of affection. For 3 years she kept her head down, worked harder than anyone asked her to, and waited for something that never quite arrived. Not warmth, exactly, just enough neutrality to build a life on. It never came. The day she turned 20, Garrett called her into the office and did not ask her to sit. He had a ledger open on the desk, one column already totaled. Room, board, schooling fees, mending, he said, tapping each line without looking up, against the labor you've provided the last 3 years. Comes out even, near enough. I'm calling it closed. He slid a small tin box across the desk. $17.40, counted out exact, not a cent more for kindness' sake, and beside it, a single folded deed. Your father's old salvage claim on the Cormorant. Never worth the paper. Consider it your share of the family and call us square. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The arithmetic did the cruelty for him. Wren did not argue. She had learned, in 3 years under that roof, that arguing with a ledger never once changed its total. She folded the deed into her coat, pocketed the tin box, and went upstairs to pack. She took almost nothing: a spare shirt, her father's old canvas kit bag, a small folding knife, a coil of good line because good line is never wasted. At the very bottom of the bag, wrapped in a handkerchief so it wouldn't rattle against the knife, she placed the brass compass. Then she walked down to the dock, caught the early coastal steamer with the last of her $17, and did not look back at the harbor office once. The steamer ran 2 days along a coast that grew wilder with every mile, the trim, painted towns giving way to weathered gray ones, then to nothing but rock and scrub pine and the white scream of gulls. By the time the boat put in at the landing nearest Widow Slough, there was no town left to speak of, only a scattering of shacks, a general store with one dusty window, and a wagon track running off into marsh grass. The man who drove her out, a leathery old freight hauler named Purdy who took her last coins for the ride, spent the whole trip trying, not unkindly, to talk her out of it. "Ain't nothing out there but mud and rust, miss," he said, spitting over the wagon rail. "Whole cove's cursed, if you believe the old stories. That sub's been sitting there since before I had my first tooth pulled. Men have poked at her for salvage steel and come away with nothing but tetanus and bad dreams." Wren said only that she'd come a long way to see it for herself, and Purdy, recognizing stubbornness when he saw it, said no more. The Cormorant sat exactly where 60 years of silt had settled her, half buried on her side in the slough at low tide, her riveted hull streaked green and orange, one blunt bow poking up out of the mud like the snout of some patient, sleeping animal. She was smaller than the word submarine suggested, built in that odd, ambitious era when a few coastal companies had experimented with underwater cargo haulers to slip goods past storms and rival shippers alike. A strange, half-forgotten chapter of engineering that had mostly ended in bankruptcy and, in this case, tragedy. Barnacles crusted her conning tower. Grass grew from a crack in her deck plating. She looked, Wren had to admit, exactly as worthless as everyone kept insisting she was. And yet, standing there in the fading light, salt wind pulling at her collar, one hand resting unconsciously over the compass beneath her shirt, Wren felt something her uncle's ledger had never once accounted for. She felt, for the first time in 3 years, that she was standing somewhere that was entirely hers. What would it take to make something like that live again, and was she about to find out the hard way? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like hers before we go any further. The shack nearest the slough had belonged, once, to a lighthouse tender long since retired, and it took Wren the better part of 2 weeks just to make it fit for sleeping in. She reset the door on its hinges. She patched the roof with tar and scrap tin traded off Purdy for a morning's labor mending his wagon wheel. She learned the tides of the slough the way her father had taught her to learn any water. Not from a chart, but by watching, by wading out at dawn and marking the mudline with a stick, by noting which hours the Cormorant's deck lay exposed and which hours the slough swallowed her whole again. Her hands, soft from 3 years of ledger work and kitchen chores, split and blistered and slowly hardened back into her father's hands, calloused across the palm, nicked at the knuckle, sure in a way that had nothing to do with looking. There were mornings, especially in that first month, when the whole undertaking felt like a joke played on her at her own expense. The shack leaked. The well needed clearing. The wreck, up close, was worse than it had looked from the wagon track. Her first attempt to force the aft hatch nearly cost her 2 fingers when a rusted dog bolt sheared and the wrench flew from her grip. She sat on the mudbank afterward, nursing a bruised hand, and allowed herself, just once, to wonder whether her uncle's ledger had been right after all, whether this whole inheritance was exactly what it looked like. Nothing, dressed up as something, because nothing was all a girl like her had ever been offered. It was an old woman named Nell Ashford who found her sitting there. Nell had kept the region's lighthouse for 31 years before her eyes gave out, and the company pensioned her off to a cottage on the bluff above the slough, and she had a habit of walking the shoreline every evening whether anyone wanted her company or not. She looked at Wren's split knuckles, looked at the rusted hull crouched in the mud, and said nothing comforting at all. Instead she said, in the flat, unbothered voice of someone who has outlived several kinds of grief, "Things don't sink to be forgotten, girl. They sink so they can wait for hands patient enough to find them, and it's rarely the first hands that come looking." Then she turned and walked on up the bluff, leaving Wren to make of it what she would. Wren didn't understand it. She wrote it down anyway, on the back of an old receipt, and pinned it above her cot, because something in her father's training told her that a strange line worth remembering was worth keeping close until its meaning arrived on its own schedule. Help, when it came, arrived the way her father had always said real help arrives, without asking permission and without needing thanks. Cyrus Dole, a carpenter 2 shacks down, showed up one morning with a level and a bundle of good lumber and simply started resetting her sagging porch post, grunting a greeting and nothing more. Widow Mercer, who ran the only oven for 6 miles, began leaving a warm loaf on Wren's step twice a week, never staying to be invited in. And Tobias Reed, the settlement's blacksmith, wandered down to look at the Cormorant's seized hatch mechanism one afternoon, turned the frozen wheel with a critical eye, and said only, "Bring it up to the forge when you're ready to cut it loose. I'll trade you the heat for a proper look at whatever's inside." None of them asked about her uncle, or her grief, or her plans. They watched her work, decided she was building something worth helping build, and simply began helping. It was, Wren thought, the first honest kindness she'd been offered in 3 years, and it asked nothing of her in return but competence, which, luckily, was the one thing she had in ready supply. Aldous Pruitt came calling before the month was out. He owned the cannery 2 coves over and, by extension, most of the salt work and half the mortgages in the settlement, and he arrived at Wren's shack in a good coat entirely wrong for the mud, offering $30 for the Cormorant's salvage rights before she'd even properly opened the hull. $30 was, on its face, an act of generosity toward a claim everyone agreed was worthless, and that was exactly what told Wren it wasn't. A man like Pruitt did not open his wallet for nothing. She thanked him, declined politely, and watched his easy smile flatten by a degree as he climbed back into his trap and drove off promising to let the offer stand, in case she came to her senses. She had no intention of coming to any senses, but her OWNIT was Tobias's forge, in the end, that gave her the clue she needed, though it came from her father's teaching before it came from the blacksmith's fire. She'd brought a length of the Cormorant's hull plating up for him to look at, a scrap knocked loose during her failed attempt on the hatch, and while he turned it in the coals, Wren found herself absently rapping her knuckles along a spare section of pipe stacked against the forge wall, the way her father used to test a seam. Full pipe rang one way. Empty pipe rang another. It was the oldest trick in a waterman's kit, and she'd done it 1,000 times without thinking. She did it now, out of habit, on a second scrap of the sub's plating Tobias had pulled from a crate of salvage nobody had ever bothered cataloging, and the ring came back wrong. Hollow, in a place that, by every plan of a vessel like the Cormorant, ought to have been solid double-hulled steel. "That's not ballast tank," she said slowly, turning the scrap over. "That's a false wall." Tobias raised an eyebrow but said nothing, only handed her a cold chisel from his bench, the way a man hands over a tool to someone he's already decided knows what to do with it. Her father's voice came back to her clear as if he were standing at her shoulder. "The sea doesn't lie to you. It tells you exactly what's wrong, if you're patient enough to listen with your hands instead of your eyes." Something had been built inside that hull that was never meant to show up on a cargo manifest, and after 3 years of being told she was worth exactly what a ledger said and not a cent more, Wren Calloway intended to find out precisely what it was. The work of getting into that false wall took the better part of 2 weeks, and it is worth lingering on, because it was here that everything her father had ever taught her finally came together in a single sustained act. First came the tide work, timing every session to the 4 hours of low water that left the Cormorant's flank exposed and dry enough to work, then retreating before the slough came creeping back in, hissing over the mud. Then came the rust. 60 years of salt air had welded every external fitting into a single fused mass, and Wren spent 3 full low tides doing nothing but soaking the hatch bolts in oil, tapping them a quarter turn at a time with a brass drift so as not to shear the heads, exactly as her father had taught her on harbor engines half that age. "Rust doesn't care how strong you are," he used to say. "It only cares whether you're patient longer than it is stubborn." She rigged a block and tackle off a jurymast lashed to the exposed bow, borrowed weight enough from Cyrus's toolshed to give her leverage a girl her size wouldn't otherwise have had. She cut through the outer plating Tobias had identified with a hand chisel and a maul, working in careful, listening strokes, stopping every few blows to press her palm flat against the steel and feel for the hollow give that told her she hadn't yet struck the false wall's edge. Twice she broke through to nothing but packed mud and had to reroute, checking her position against the pipe ring pattern she'd mapped out with chalk across the whole exposed section like a chart of soundings. It was slow, unglamorous, bruising work, knuckles split again, shoulders screaming, salt sweat stinging every cut, and there was no music to it, no dramatic flash of insight, only the same unhurried repetition her father had built his whole life around. Test. Adjust. Strike. Listen. Test again. On the 14th day, working the chisel along a seam she'd cross-marked from 3 directions, the steel gave with a groan instead of a ring, and a slab of false plating the size of a door swung inward on hinges that had clearly been fitted by someone who meant this space to be reopened, not sealed forever. Cold, stale air rolled out to meet her, air that had not moved in 60 years, and for a long moment Wren simply knelt there at the opening, her lantern raised, her heart going hard enough that she could feel the compass thump against her collarbone in time with it. Then, silence. And into that silence, she climbed through. The chamber beyond was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10, tucked between the Cormorant's outer cargo hold and her engine room, built, Wren would later understand, as a private compartment for whichever officer had charge of the vessel's most valuable freight. Lantern light found it in pieces, a narrow steel bunk, its blanket long since rotted to a gray felt. A writing desk bolted to the wall, its surface still holding, impossibly, an inkwell and a dry, brittle pen. Books swollen fat with old damp, their spines unreadable, stacked with a neatness that spoke of a man who had kept order even as his air ran short. And against the far wall, half buried under a fall of collapsed shelving, an iron strongbox and, beside it, wedged into a niche clearly carved for the purpose, a small carved wooden bird, its wings frozen mid-spread, painted feathers dulled by decades of dark. It was the kind of object a man makes with his own hands for someone he loves, and Wren understood, looking at it, that she had stopped excavating cargo and started excavating a life. The strongbox was not locked. Whoever had shut this room the last time had never expected, or perhaps never wanted, to keep anyone out who was patient enough to get this far. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as leather, lay coin. Not a fortune by the standards of Pruitt's cannery ledgers, perhaps, but by the standards of a girl who had walked into this cove with $17.40 to her name, it was a small mountain, gold and silver both, $462 by her count when she finally sat down to add it twice over by lantern light, plus a second, smaller pouch of loose pearls that must have once been meant for a woman's hands. And on top of it all, protected inside a tin the size of a cigar box, a letter, the ink faded to brown but the hand still firm, addressed on the outside in careful copperplate, to whoever finds this. Wren read it twice through before she trusted her own eyes. The man who had written it gave his name as Elias Bourne, engineer aboard the Cormorant in the autumn of her final, disastrous voyage. The storm that had driven her hard aground in the slough and, according to the company's own insurance claim at the time, killed no one at all. Bourne's letter told a different story. He wrote of 6 men trapped below decks when the hull breached, of a company agent who falsified the manifest and the death rolls both to avoid paying out the men's wages and their widows' claims, pocketing the difference and letting the town believe the crew had simply walked off before the storm, cowards who'd abandoned ship. He wrote of his own choice to seal himself into this compartment with the ship's strongbox rather than let that same agent get his hands on it, trusting that the sea would keep it safer than any bank the company controlled, and trusting, too, though he could not have known how long the wait would be, that someone patient and honest enough to open that wall was someone who deserved what waited behind it more than the men who'd have stolen it outright. His last lines were not bitter. "I do not know who you are," he had written, "only that you worked to reach this place, and that tells me more about your character than any name could." Pay the men what they were owed if any trace of their people can still be found. See that this money does some good in a town that let a lie stand for the truth. And if nothing else can be done, at least let it be known that 6 men did not desert their post. They stayed, and they were left. He signed it simply, with the date, and beneath his name, a smaller line, added as if after some hesitation. Tell my Margaret, if she ever hears of this, that I thought of her carving until the very end. The wooden bird, Wren understood then, had been meant for a wife who never learned what became of him. She sat a long while in that cold, close room with the lantern guttering low, the letter in one hand and her father's compass in the other, and felt the full, strange weight of what had just been placed in her care. Not a windfall to be pocketed and spent on herself, but a debt 60 years unpaid, handed to the one person patient enough to notice it was owed. What would you have done, in her place, with a dead man's last wish sitting heavy in your palm? Let us know in the comments what you think you'd have chosen. She did not spend a single dollar of it on herself, not at first, and not out of martyrdom but out of a plain sense that the money already had an owner's instructions attached to it, and her father had raised her to honor a job's true purpose over her own convenience. Her first stop, once the coin was safely counted and the letter copied out twice in her own careful hand, was the county recorder's office 2 towns over, where she spent 3 patient days going through 60-year-old shipping records until she found what Bourne's letter had promised was there. The original crew manifest of the Cormorant, 6 names listed as deserters in the company's official report, and a second, unfiled ledger page, tucked inside an old insurance claim, clearly meant to have been destroyed, that recorded those same 6 men as drowned, their wages and death benefits marked paid in a column that had never once reached their families. 2 of the 6 had living descendants still in the region, a granddaughter running a boarding house 40 miles up the coast, and a nephew working the salt flats near Pruitt's own cannery. Wren found them both, and paid each family, plainly and without ceremony, the wages and benefits Bourne's letter had asked her to see settled, plus interest she calculated herself, the same exacting way her Uncle Garrett might have, except that her arithmetic, unlike his, was in service of a debt owed rather than one invented. What was left after that, she put back into the cove itself. She paid Cyrus Dole a fair wage, not a favor's worth, to help her rebuild the shack into a proper diving station with a real workshop. She commissioned Tobias to forge new hardware for a modest salvage operation, one that could recover scrap and cargo honestly instead of Pruitt's habit of buying up wrecks for pennies and stripping them without paying anyone what their labor was worth. She restored Nell Ashford's old lighthouse lens, dark for a decade, and paid to have it relit, because a coastline this treacherous deserved better than darkness, and because some private, unspoken part of her wanted to thank the old woman properly for a cryptic sentence that had turned out, in the end, to be exactly true. Watching the town's opinion of her turn was a slow thing. Built 1 paid debt and 1 relit lamp at a time rather than any single dramatic gesture, but turn it did. Where she had arrived a stranger dismissed as a fool chasing rust, she became, within a season, the person the settlement quietly organized itself around. Aldous Pruitt did not take the change well. He'd built half his fortune on exactly the kind of quiet theft Bourne's letter exposed, and when word reached him that Wren Calloway was paying out 60-year-old wage debts from a strongbox he'd once tried to buy for $30, he understood, faster than most, precisely what she'd found and precisely what it threatened. He came to her workshop a second time, coat still wrong for the mud, and tried a different tone this time. Talk of partnership, of protecting her interests from men who might not have her welfare at heart. Wren let him finish. Then she set the unfiled insurance ledger page on the workbench between them, the one that proved the company, and by extension, men very much like him, had falsified a death claim to avoid paying 6 drowned crewmen their due. She did not accuse him of anything. She simply let him look at it, and watched him understand, in the particular silence that follows a man realizing the ground under his leverage has quietly disappeared, that there would be no partnership, and no more lowball offers either. He left without his coat staying dry, and he did not come calling again. The reckoning that mattered more to Wren arrived by letter of her own, 3 weeks later, addressed to Garrett Calloway at the harbor office. She did not write to gloat. She wrote, in the same plain hand Bourne had used, to inform her uncle that the estate he'd once called settled had, in fact, produced considerably more than $17.40, and that she intended to establish a proper trust in her father's name for the maintenance of the Hollow Point lighthouse and harbor. A trust that, as it happened, made the Calloway Harbor Office's usual maintenance contracts entirely unnecessary going forward. She never learned exactly what Garrett said when he read it, only that within the year, the Harbor Board quietly declined to renew his position, citing budget matters his own ledgers could no longer justify away. He did not write back. He did not need to. The columns had simply, finally, stopped adding up in his favor, and a man who had always measured his own worth in tidy sums found himself, for the first time, unable to argue with the total. By the time a full year had turned, the shack by Widow Slough had become something Wren's father would have recognized instantly and been proud of past words. A working salvage station, her father's old diving dress hung cleaned and mended by the door beside a newer suit of her own, a ledger of her own keeping open on the desk, one that recorded, in her own hand, debts paid rather than debts extracted. The lighthouse beam swept the cove every night now, steady as a held breath, and Nell Ashford still walked the shoreline most evenings, though these days she stopped to talk rather than simply pass a stray line of wisdom and move on. Widow Mercer's bread came twice a week still, though now Wren paid for it, and was glad to. Tobias's forge rang most mornings with honest work, some of it hers, some of it the town's, and Cyrus had built, at Wren's particular request, a small covered shelter on the bluff, open to the water, where the granddaughter of one of Bourne's drowned crewmen liked to sit some Sundays with flowers for a grave that had never had a marker until now. In the evenings, when the tide was out and the light went long and gold across the mud flats, Wren had taken to sitting on the Cormorant's exposed deck with two objects laid side by side in her open palm. Her father's brass compass, its needle steady as ever, and Elias Bourne's small carved wooden bird, wings still frozen mid-flight after 60 patient years in the dark. One man had given her the tool to find her way. Another, a stranger she would never meet, had trusted that whoever found their way to him would be worth trusting with everything he had left. She thought, most evenings, that the two gifts amounted to nearly the same lesson, learned twice over from two men who never knew each other and never would. That worth was not a number in someone else's ledger, and that patience, applied honestly, eventually pays every debt it's owed. She was 20 years old, and she had been cast out of one family with $17.40 to her name, and she had built, from a wreck nobody wanted, a life no ledger could have predicted. Thank you for staying with us for this story of patience, and of debts that outlast the men who owe them. If Wren's journey moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who's ever been told they were worth exactly what someone else decided to write down. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you won't miss our next tale of ordinary people who found something extraordinary in the wreckage everyone else had already given up on. We'd love to know, what have you found value in that someone else had already dismissed as worthless? Tell us in the comments below. Until then, be well, and remember, some things sink not to be forgotten, but to wait for the hands patient enough to find them.